1937 Studebaker Modified Chassis Build Part 2. Well, where the heck is Part 3? How you doing, everybody? Guess what? I'm gonna work on my Studebaker. Can you believe it? It's been a busy 2 or 3 months. We were up in Titan for a week, and then we got back, and oh man, I've been busy at work, and then I had a bunch of chores that I neglected around the house. Of course, I had to finish my Studebaker model. You've seen that video. So no more dicking around. I'm getting back on the chassis. But first, I'll give you a brief synopsis of how Titan went and show you a couple of things we brought back. Okay, let's see that. Ah yes, the 4th annual Titan Grand Prix. You know, I've been to all 4, and by far, this one was the best. It was the best run because the city got involved, and there were more spectators, and then the mighty Titan Warehouse, they got involved more so. And it just worked out real well. And we had 25 teams, 25 cars, and 9 events for the weekend. So it was action-packed. I'm sure all you faithful have seen the Titan videos already. And then a couple things we brought back. I bought a Titan Grand Prix bandana. You know, you've heard me say Titan or Titan. Well, Titan is an Indian name, so Titan is the correct pronunciation for those of you who are interested. One of the events was the Concours d'Elegance, and all the cars are displayed there, and then the cars are judged by fellow builders. So I was surprised when the BMW won first place for beauty, and then doubly surprised when the BMW won first place overall. What an honor to be voted first place by the builders. That was indeed an honor. Here's the cars. I still haven't cleaned up the monocar. Still dirty. Still has some things that need to be repaired. The BMW, I cleaned it all up, and it's doing all right, as well as old 27, because some people came over to the house and to test drive and check them out, so I cleaned that up. But this one, yeah, I got some work to do. If you watch the videos, you know that the BMW broke a front spring. There's how it broke right at the bolt hole. This is a buggy spring off of a horse-drawn carriage, the seat spring. And here's a vintage Cartco spring. And it's interesting to note that these Cartco springs were patterned after this spring. And so when it broke, we took one of the vintage springs, and Joey and I had this switched out in 30 minutes, and we continued on with our weekend. And then if you watch the video, the last video, the Campbell Cup, then you'll know that I broke a spring, and here's what it looks like, because you can't see it in the video, but there you can see it. So when that right there where it broke should be down here. When that broke, then this axle shifted 2 or 3 inches, and I couldn't keep it on the course. I had to slow down, and if I went too fast, it'd get out of control. And what brought me to the pits is I come off the steep hill and down at the bottom, and I spun out. So I limped back. Anyway, that was pretty scary, so kind of learned my lesson there. When something feels screwy, just slow down and pull in. Okay. So as you know, I took some parts up there, some vintage Cartco parts. These parts are getting a name for themselves. A lot of the builders are using them now because they're just really well made. And since these guys are buddies of mine, they asked me, a couple of guys asked up north if some parts were coming up. So Jack asked if I'd take them up, and I said sure. So I had a great time with the guys that bought parts. They're all building cars, so that's a lot of fun. And then for me taking these up there, I do some horse trading with Ron, for parts, pieces, welding. It works out pretty good, you know. I like it because I don't want to be involved in making any money. I just want to enjoy my hobby. If others want to make parts and make a little money, great. But all I'm after is enough to build my next car, you know, or a little bit of help here and there. So that works out. Okay, well, I'll tell you more about Titan as I'm working through the chassis here and there. So what do you say I show you where we left off? If you remember, in the last video, I was heating and bending steel around the axle shape, and I was going to take it over to Ron's place and have Travis weld it up. So it turns out that, you know, 3 months ago I filmed a couple segments over at Ron's place. So let me show you those now. That'll bring us up to speed, and then I'll show you, I have the chassis here at the house now and the new motor plate, and I'll show you where we're heading with it, okay? We're actually getting to building again. Yeah. So I'm over here at Ron's place. This is the home of Vintage Car Co. So he sent me some photographs of this front axle we've been working on, so I just came over to take a look. So let's see what's going on. So there's Ron's laser machine. Down there's some brake presses. They make all kinds of steel components and shapes. They also make LED lighting. They've been at this for over 20 years. Really have a good eye for quality. Everybody's pretty much gone home. Over there is where Travis's welding station is. He's the artist who welded up this axle I'm going to show you. So they can make just about anything here. So let's go look at the Vintage Car Co side of the equation. So they have a few cars sitting out here in the shop, but most of them are inside here. Alright. This is where they do all the assembly. Of course, they make all the parts out there in the shop. Here's one they're working on right now, doing some upgrades. So one thing's for sure, Ron loves cycle carts. So anyway, let me show you the axle. So you remember my drawing here. So, and you saw in the last video where I put the rough shape together to bring it over to have Travis weld it. There's my pattern and my drawings. So here's the axle. This thing is a piece of art. I mean, that Travis, he can weld and prep. Man, he's good. So what you see here is in essence a copy, slightly larger than a go-kart spindle, but bushed properly and with a 5/8 axle. Just stout as all get up. That's a proven setup. And then here's my spring perch all welded on. And then here's a nice touch. It's got a little cutout in there for the head of the bolt so the kingpin won't spin when you're tightening the bolt. Still have to put on the brackets. You know, but the whole idea is the tie rods will run in above the frame, which is the way I like to build it. So we're making progress. I really appreciate the effort these guys have put into this. This is far beyond what I was looking for. It's really artwork, so I'm just tickled pink. So, all right. All right, it's nice to have the chassis back in the shop. So let me show you how I've made a little progress here. I have the shackles put together. I put the rubber bushings in here. I still have to cut these bolts to length. And I still have to make the brackets here for the tie rods. But I have it propped up so I can determine the height of where the rubber block is going to be and the piece of steel that will be welded here. There'll also be a piece of steel down here which will accept the panhard rod, which will run straight across and bolt through the axle here, but then attach to the frame here, so that will keep the axle stout. I have this thing right where I want it, so I'll show you that more about that in a minute. This is the rack and pinion setup that the Carco guys are experimenting with. One thing was determined on this, that the ratio is considerably slower than a go-kart steering. So if you've learned to drive with a go-kart, you'd find you have to turn the wheel quite a bit more. But if you'd never driven one, you'd learn, you know, driving the rack and pinion. They're playing with the ratio. The length of this arm has a lot to do with turning radius and speed of, the ratio of the steering. So not sure if I'm going to do it yet, but it would certainly fit up here in my design without any problem. Okay, so here's the motor plate, and I'm going with a differential. I got that in while I was waiting on the plate. So if you remember my drawing, I gave Ron my concept. The CAD guy over there worked on it, and he came up with this plate, and it's pretty nice. It drops right inside of the welded frame I made. These I could either bolt it on or I could weld it on. It's a little bit wider than my frame here. This is where the bearing mounts, because on their chassis that they're developing, using this as a guide, theirs has to be wider so more people can fit in it. So that's the extra width on each side required. So this same motor plate will drop into their frame, their chassis. Now you can see I haven't notched the steel here yet, so that'll be down here, and then the bearing will mount. And then there's also another bearing here and over. Let me move this bearing here and one on the other side there. So there's 4 bearings, which is pretty cool. Okay, so this is the sliding adjustment plate. You have a bolt through here. This is bolted on through those threaded inserts, and then there's a bolt in there, and this will slide back and forth. So you loosen the bolts, turn that, and you can tighten your chain. That's a nice feature. This is steel. It's probably 10 gauge, laser cut, welded together, lightened up. Now on this differential, let me show you a picture here. So this is the setup of one of their typical carts. And you see on the differential here, here's the disc for the brakes, and here is the sprocket. So on mine, the sprocket would be here, and the disc would be here, and then the caliper will be here, hydraulic, and the lines will go up 2 pedals, which obviously I don't have yet. So, and you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 bearings. Alright. Now I'm going to show you about this ride height thing now. Okay, on ride height, all of my cars have a slight rake to them. In other words, the front of the chassis is lower than the rear by a little. It's about an inch difference, inch drop on the front on old number 27, and when you stand back and look at it out in the driveway, you can see the rake. It's a nice subtle rake. I think it makes the cars look pretty cool. So I had to come up with what I wanted to do here. So at the center of that 3-inch rail is where the axle will be. So we know the ride height in the rear. It's established in this design. So up here I want the top. I could have the center of the axle here, right at the center of the tubing, 1.5, just like the rear. But instead, I want it at the top of this chassis. So that will give me an 1.5 rake front to rear, which I think will look cool with this hot rod kind of design I've got going with. You've seen my model. It has the same kind of rake to it. Matter of fact, let me get that. So viewed from just the right angle, you'll see that the front, it's raked. lowered a little. And the model I did it with different size wheels, but I'll have the same size wheels on the cart, so I'm doing it in the chassis because the body tends to follow the line of the chassis along the bottom. So when it's all done, I want it to have a nice rake to it. I'd bet that the body will be 5 inches off the ground at the front by the time I'm done. So anyway, I've got this propped up, centered up. It's just loose, and I was able to measure the height, and I'll establish the width, and for all the pieces, for the mount for the panhard rod and the mount for the spring perch. And getting the right height correct in the rear is easy. You just center it up. So I have this, there's my pattern for the axle. I'd send a drawing of that to anybody who wanted one. Okay, so I have this, just bear with me here. So using this ruler, see how I have the top of the chassis at the axle height, and so that's pretty cool. I'm happy with that, and I have my measurements now, so I can make the pieces I need to weld together. And this is tilted down 3 degrees, which gives it that positive camber, which is period correct for the 20s and 30s. That's how the cars looked back then. Okay, so next order of business, fabricate. I have these 2 brackets to make here. This is going to be 3/16 steel. Here's a rubber block. Remember, this is for the panhard rod mount, and I will cut the bottom to follow the radius of the axle. Here's the pieces. I have to drill a couple of holes in them. Make it easier to do it now. I was cleaning up a cabinet the other day, and I come across a piece of rubber here. It's just perfect for this rubber block. I've worked with this particular rubber before, and it cuts easy on the bandsaw, and it takes a nice hole when you try to drill it. So nice find. That bandsaw is the handiest tool. Here I notched the rubber piece, and here's the assembly mocked up. Rubber block, 2 pieces of 3/16 steel. So I'll clean all this scale off, and then I'll weld it up, drill a hole through it, and that would be ready to mount. I still have to do this one. Yep. I managed to weld up the spring perch, and then on the block I made a little relief bevel to get past the welds, and that goes on here like this. So that's looking just fine. So with this magnet, I'm going to mock it up here real quick. I had done a rudimentary drawing here with dimensions to give me a guideline. And the mock-up is working out okay. Let's see. So I have this clamp on here, and as I tighten it up, it raises up the center of the axle. So I have that pretty much where it belongs. And then I have this piece here, and you'll notice, hang on here, follows the shape of the axle because it's going to be right up under here. It looks like it's a little on the long side. Anyway, that's where the panhard rod is going to attach. Okay. Yeah, this is nice and stout already, but ultimately I'll add some gussets or something in here. Keep it simple, but nice and stout. Okay, let's keep moving along. Continuing on, I moved the chassis inside. I proceeded to cut off all the bolts, so now they're the proper length. And this spring, having that compressed, represents the weight of the front end on the axle and spring, because it will compress a little bit. So now I'm going to turn my attention to the radius rods. So I spent a fair amount of time thinking about them, and I'll show you what I came up with. Okay, let's talk about radius rods. I've made two styles. This was my first attempt. This was a steel bracket that was made to go over the axle, and then this is I think it was a 1/2-inch tube, and it had a 3/8 threaded rod inside of it, and I screwed that onto a heim joint, and then I welded the threaded rod here. Well, this broke right here. So then my next attempt was this one here on the BMW, and it's real straightforward. It's 3/16 steel, has a bend here to attach, it's welded. This is not a heim joint, it's just the bolt's just a little bit loose. That's a stop nut, lock nut, and you know, not very fancy and not very pretty, but it's stout as hell, and I don't think it's going to break. So let me show you what I've been planning for my third attempt at making a radius rod for the Studebaker. Since the Studebaker has a hot rod theme, I went online and looked at different radius rods for cars of the era and hot rods, and you'll see things you know, out of steel or aluminum where they capture the axle, and they have a rod end on them, or a place for a bushing actually. I've seen them where it appears that they take a block of aluminum and machine it up, drill some holes in it, and that would make a dang nice looking radius rod. So I have a mill, and I can, you know, get a block of steel down at the block of aluminum or steel. So I even went so far as to dimension it out, and decided that I was going to go down this morning and see what they had at Industrial Metals, where I get all the items. But I also came up with this alternative. I went down there early, and then I saw these other things, and then I came back and thought about it some more. And I thought about making, they have this thick wall tubing that I could buy, and then they have these threaded inserts. They're a weld bung. You slip them in, weld them on, and then it'll accept a rod end that's 1/2 by 20 thread, fine thread, or regular thread, I guess. Then they have bar steel that I could, you know, heat and bend. I could weld it right here to capture. And I thought, well, I could heat it up and pound it flat to create a place for a bolt to go through. And the diameter of this tube would be the same, or this steel would be the same as this tube, and I could turn it on my lathe to fit inside, then weld it. So I had actually come up with this version I was going to make. And then I got to really looking around down there, and they have some interesting components. Let me show you what I found down there, or this idea that I have. here is the anatomy of what I'm going to experiment with. This tube right here, and I'll show it to you in detail directly, is a piece of decorative steel for fencing, high-end steel fencing. And I'll show you that, like I say, but it will accept the welded bung and the rod end, and then a piece of bar steel that will be welded on here and then heated and bent to meet the angle of the axle. So let me show you. I'm going to put the camera in the tripod and I'll show you the parts and pieces. So I'm wandering around the showroom down there at Industrial Metals this morning, and I came across these. This is a component for a high-end steel fence. This is stamped steel. It's fairly heavy. You can tell it's welded, 2 halves. And it looks like the whole thing was done on a machine, all the grinding and welding. Anyway, I took a chance that this was started out a stick wall. Whoops, because it is tube, and it looks fairly thick there. So they're eight bucks. So I bought 2 of them. I figured I can experiment, and you know, if it ends up being a bust or it just plain looks stupid, I can go back to something different. So I bought a couple of them, I brought them home, and I cut it 9 inches each way from center, and sure enough, it's a fairly heavy wall tube, which is just what I was hoping for. And so then in the end of this fits, this is a threaded insert. Here's a rod end. This is a 1/2 inch by 20 thread pitch, and then a threaded insert to match it that screws on there. And then this is a weld bung, so the idea is that this slips in here. I haven't deburred it, so it's a little stout, and I see it's that label's in the way. So anyway, it goes in there like that. And you can see how it's beveled here to allow you to weld it around. So that's not looking too bad to start with. So this would come off the side of the frame like this and go up to the front axle. You can see that. So the challenge becomes is, how do I turn the corner here, or I want a really stout connection right there at the axle, because that's where it broke on the other one. So as it turns out, this steel rod here, let's see, I think it's 3/4. It fits in here nicely. So I can slip that in there a certain length and drill holes in the tube, weld it on. But before I do that, I can heat it up and I can bend it to match that angle right there, so that it'll go through a hole that's drilled through the axle, a nice perfect hole. This will slip in and then it'll be welded in. That'll be a solid connection. It'll articulate back here off of the rod end, but be nice and solid up there. Yeah, and I think that might look hot rod-esque. What the heck, it's getting creative. That's what the guys back in the late 30s were doing. They were getting creative. So here's the piece, that one of the cutoffs. Nice tapered little tube. That could come in handy for something decorative. Anyway, so on the model here, right here is where the radius rod exits, and I want the body to be below that point, if you can see that. So I'm hoping that I can attach to the frame and still have enough room in there for that not to be a problem and look okay, like it's going to come out of the body. Alright, so I have to do some fabrication here and some heating and bending, so, and then I'll attach it with a nice large bolt with a bracket I'll make that'll weld to the chassis here, and then that's a stop nut. So I'm going to make it as stout as I can, and I think this will jazz it up a little, make it look better than just a straight rod. Okay, I'm going to set up to bend this and weld this. Okay. Okay, so I put the chassis up on jack stands so that I could mock up the radius rods, basically. But that set in motion a number of sequential things that had to happen. So it started with finding the center of the axle, then establishing the height of the axle, which I did with this clamp. Then I had to clamp the whole axle to the chassis. That's what this is right here. That's the correct spacing. And now I know the axle is plumb. So it's centered, it's the right height, and it's plumb. So then I proceeded to start mocking up this radius rod. You saw me bend the steel rod, which is right here. Right now it's just clamped on underneath. I really was planning on coming through here, but I might find a way to capture that and attach it at the bottom, because you can see it's fairly level. It'll end up running uphill to hit there, but that's no big deal. I'll think about that. Then I had to come up with a bracket, and this is about as simple as I could come up with. I like to keep things just as simple as I can and nice and strong. Then I don't have to worry about things breaking. This is a piece of 1/4 by 1.5. I heated it and bent it, and then put a bend in it and then drilled the hole. That's a 1/2 by 1.5 with a lock nut. Here's the bracket for the other side. And then the rod. Yeah, that might just work out. It sure would be easier to weld on here. Then I wouldn't have to, you know, compromise the integrity of the axle drilling a hole in it. So, anyway, I'll work on this other side too. Okay, I'm already past the 30-minute mark on this video, so let's call it the end of part 3. And I'll be back soon with part 4. We'll keep moving along. And as always, thanks for watching.